Curioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 242, Dragons, Mud, and Glory, the early history of Welsh rugby. So, this week we want to turn our attention to some of the sports that have come about in the mid to late 1800s that are turning into something very different from what they previously were. Keeping in mind that what we now call rugby and football, or association football, if you want to use the term of the time, these games were at one time one game and played in what can only be called a chaotic fashion. And there's lots of arguments and discussions about exactly what might have constituted the rules or not so much rules, what and how they migrated in between being sort of a communal thing into a cross neighborhood thing into being a cross village or town game, and how all of these things came about. Now, we do have organized games that have come before this. You have tennis, which has come about at this long before this. You have cricket, which began before this, and we will touch on those as well eventually. I wanted to focus at least initially on rugby, and then in the next episode, work on football. And I'm hoping to make sure that that gets covered as well as I can do. But I think it's good to start off with rugby. It's the sport that Wales was very good at for a very long time, and it's a sport that they have been known for. And so it's something that I think most people, if they know much about Wales, recognize that as being an important part of Welsh culture. Now, in order to discuss it, we have to go back and talk about the English aspects of it. So let's begin in the early 19th century in the rolling hills of Warwickshire at a prestigious public school, simply at that time called Rugby School. The legend, of course, is famous and, of course, as always, famously suspect. In 1823, as the story goes, a schoolboy named William Webb Ellis, supposedly with fine disregard for the rules of football, first took the ball in his arms and ran with it. That image of a rebellious act sparked a new sport has endured in some state for about 2 centuries. There's even a plaque at the school and a statue to commemorate it. But here's the catch. There's no, obviously, contemporary evidence that this actually happened. The story doesn't appear in writing until decades later, as so often happens. Memory's a fun thing, and some historians think it was concocted to give the game a romantic origin story. What's far more certain is this. In the early 1800s, there was no single version of football. Every school played its own chaotic variant. Some allowed handling of the ball, others forbade it. Some allowed violent tackling, or as they called it then, hacking, which meant kicking an opponent in the shins to stop them, while others, and you can imagine how painful that would have been, while others tried to tame the violence. Rugby school was particularly known for its rough and physical style. Matches often involved dozens of boys in a scrum-like mass, pushing and wrestling for territory. The handling of the ball wasn't yet formalized. Obviously, there was no rule for picking it up or kicking it or who does what when. But over time, rugby school developed a unique tradition of running with the ball, which became a defining characteristic of that school. By the 1840s and 50s, this informal schoolyard games began migrating out into the world, as former public school students went on to attend Oxford, Cambridge, or inform gentlemen's clubs in cities, or they would take the games with them in other aspects, and we're going to get into all of that here shortly. But this created a problem. In all of this shifting and bringing of the various rules, much like if you think about it, like imagine a card game where everybody has a slightly different version of that game. The one that comes to mind for me is Uno. If you know the game, then you know what I'm talking about. Uno is a card game wherein literally there are so many variant rules that I have played under that I can tell you that there almost seems to be a house rule in every house. And so that makes the games a little chaotic at times. Sometimes it makes it very stilted because if you're playing straight by the rules, if you're used to other rules, it can kind of hamstring you. But in the case of rugby, this also was the situation. Every school, every gentleman's club, every military unit had its own variation of what the rules were. Growing up as a young man myself, I know that we played a version of a game that could be loosely termed similar to rugby, wherein one person had an object which they then ran with while the entire schoolyard, it felt like, chased that person down, tackled them, and when they got tackled, they had to throw it up into the air, and then the next person took off with it. Usually they were boys, and they would run until the next person got tackled. And basically they were doing this because we weren't allowed to play football. Now, when I say football, I mean American style football. And so they banned us playing that game. And so we found a much worse game to play, in my opinion. But that's the way it goes, And so we created this game. We created its own set of rules loosely. And there was injuries and all sorts of problems. And somehow it never did really get stopped. And so I can see how this would kind of create a similar environment where everybody kind of had their own version of what the rules were and what they weren't. And you might have two teams show up to play and spend an hour just arguing about how many players each side had, what constituted a foul, or whether the ball could be picked up at all, or whether it should be kicked. And while this may sound oldie-timey, quaint, it also posed a serious barrier in football, or what we will call rugby soon enough, becoming an organized sport. Some schools and clubs even kept their own printed rule books. For example, the Rugby School of 1845 had one of the earliest known sets and established the try, originally just a chance for a try for a goal after touching the ball down. Points weren't awarded for the try itself, only for the resulting kick. As the game spread, clubs began springing up all across England, including in Blackheath, Richmond, Guy's Hospital, and Harlequins, each one developing slightly different practices. The lack of standardization led to growing frustration, particularly amongst the inter-club competitions, because there was no home, every home had a rule. And so this eventually would lead to the formation of the Rugby Football Union in 1871 to try and codify what the rules were. But of course, even before we jump ahead of that, it's also worth appreciating the cultural context of the situation. Rugby emerged not from the poorer classes, not from the normal people, in quotes, but rather it came from the higher elite institutions, and with all their traditions of discipline, hierarchy, and masculine virtue that the Victorians loved, it was not seen as merely as recreation, but also character building. An idea known for its muscular Christianity is a quote that is used. The sport was a moral endeavor to train future imperial leaders in endurance, courage, and teamwork. My own introduction actually to rugby was at high school in Canada, where we would play various games I'd never played before that, and rugby was one of those. And the thing I always remember about that is trying to go to tackle somebody who was much bigger than I was and just bouncing off them. That was my biggest memory from that as I was thinking about it later. But I think rugby, had it been more popular in Canada, I think would have had a lot of people who loved it because we love those physically violent sports, and they are very popular here. I mean, ice hockey is one of those, and it definitely is popular. So it's always been kind of interesting. While, yes, we have a rugby national team and we do compete in various events, I would argue that the sport is very, very, very niche and does not get TV time. So that kind of tells you how niche it actually is. And for the most part, I couldn't name an actual team who played it outside of the national team and the fact that my university had a women's rugby team that was very good and actually would win a lot of championships. Outside of that, I really couldn't tell you much about it. So, with all that said and done, however, While its origins in England were amongst the elite, rugby would soon break free of that narrow social cage, especially in Wales, where the game would find a much more democratic and defiant home. But of course, we need to start from the beginning, and we need to look at how the rules were finally nailed down and how the split between rugby and other forms of football became permanent. And we are going to dive a little bit into how those rules varied. We're not going to mention every single variation because there's lots, but we are going to mention a few of the more popular ones so you can kind of get an idea. As the 19th century wore on, football in Britain, of course, was a mess. There were dozens of clubs playing something called football, but they were actually playing a wildly varied game. In some games, where you have people carrying balls, some would shove and scrum and shin kick, depending on the situation or the timing or the location, while others emphasize passing and dodging, both passing via a throw and also a kick, and avoiding being tackled. This chaotic state of affairs couldn't last. As Britain was industrializing and with more urban clubs forming, travel between them became easier, obviously because of the railways. Clubs then wanted to compete, but they needed to agree on what they were playing for first. In 1863, an important meeting took place at the Freemasons Tavern in London. Several clubs met to unify football rules once and for all. This gathering would go on to create the Football Association, or the FA as we now know it. And this would create what is eventually called association football, or throughout most of the world, just football. Of course, just because some groups like that, some groups found that an attractive game to play, not everybody was on board. Clubs like Blackheath, one of the oldest and most influential rugby playing clubs, objected to the FA's proposed ban on hacking, that is, kicking an opponent in the shins, as we mentioned earlier, to stop them. Blackheath's representative, Francis Campbell, dramatically walked out of the meeting, arguing that removing hacking was making the game too soft and unmanly. That walkout was a decisive point for separating the two games. From that point forward, rugby and association football went their own ways, with rugby players sticking to the rougher, more physical game while retaining scrummages and handling, whilst football would develop a more free-flowing style focused on footwork, finesse. Rugby clung to its roots in muscular grappling chaos, and, at least to this point, its elite nature. Despite separating from football, rugby didn't have a unified rulebook. Every club still had its own quirks, so in 1871, 21 clubs met in London again, and this time with the express goal of creating a governing body for rugby. The result was the formation of the Rugby Football Union. The RFU, as it was called, based its rules primarily on those used by Rugby School. Now they were formalized and standardized for all clubs under its banner. Amongst the key elements, of course, was handling the ball was legal, including running with it. Tackling below the waist was allowed to stop runners. Scrums were used to restart play. Lineouts were used to bring the ball back in from touch. Tries were now worth points directly, not just the chance to kick for a goal. Now, if you're unfamiliar with rugby, to kind of explain a little bit of it, the bits that I understand well enough to describe. Obviously, we know what tackling is no matter what sport we're talking about. Scrums, basically where the two sides will gather and effectively will lock arms, at least at this point. I'm not exactly sure how they worked then. And basically the ball is moved around until it's brought out of the scrum, and then play keeps going from that. Lineouts is basically when the ball goes out of bounds. They have to then throw it back in, and that leads to an opportunity for both sides to try and claim the ball. And of course, tries, which in American/Canadian terms would be equivalent to a field goal, were the key way of scoring up until this point, where it now becomes as important to touch the ball down in the end zone, again, using American football terms. So, and that's the other thing with rugby. scoring a try is physically dropping the ball in the end zone. You can't simply walk over the line and, do your dance or whatever you're going to do. It doesn't count until you put it down. So that's a big part of all of this. So all of this starts to get codified, and you can see how both sides of the football rugby sides had equivalencies. You think about tries, and the fact that you had to kick a try to get points is not very different than kicking to get a goal in football. It's the nuances that start to change things, and in some cases, the outright separation of how to deal with the ball. This codification, of course, helped rugby grow rapidly, not just across England, but also throughout the British Empire to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and of course, Wales. What I didn't mention there is North America, but we will come back to that. When rugby first crossed into Wales in mid-19th century, it came via the same route as many other English customs, through schools, universities, and professions. The earliest games were played not by miners or steelworkers, but by students and gentlemen. One of the first recorded rugby games in Wales took place in Swansea in 1864, and by 1872, the Swansea Rugby Football Club, the first club in Wales, was formally established. Newport soon followed in 1874, followed by Llanelli in 1875, and then Cardiff in 1876. These coastal urban clubs were crucial outposts for the spread of the game across South Wales. But rugby would not be remaining the preserve of the elite for long. So why did rugby take hold in Wales? To understand that and why it's so differently developed in Wales versus England, you have to look at the social and cultural landscape of the time. In the late 19th century, Wales was undergoing rapid industrialization, coal mining in the south, slate quarrying in the north, and heavy industrial towns across the borders and along the southern half of the country. Towns like Merthyr Tydfil, Ebbw Vale, and Pontypridd were transforming Welsh life. Thousands of young men worked grueling jobs in the mines and the factories, and they lived in tight-knit, often impoverished communities. What rugby offered was more than just sport. It was a communal expression, a release from the discipline and social structure that they were forced into. There were a bunch of key ingredients to this. One was accessibility. Unlike cricket, which requires equipment and time, or association football, which remained largely on the periphery until the 20th century, rugby required only a ball and a field. It could be played in any weather, and it was rough and physical, just like the lives of those who were playing it. Interestingly, rugby in Wales also found an unlikely ally in the nonconformist chapels. While in England, sport often linked with elite Anglican schools and clubs, in Wales, Methodists and Baptist ministers saw rugby as a healthy, masculine, Christian pursuit that kept young men out of the pub and gave them a sense of discipline and teamwork. How little they understood, I think. In fact, many chapel leaders supported rugby clubs and encouraged moral conduct on and off the pitch. You could go to chapel on Sunday and still take pride in knocking down an opponent on Saturday, so long as you did it cleanly. Rugby became a symbol of local pride, as typical of most sports. When a team from a small village beat a bigger town, it wasn't just a sporting victory, it was a cultural one. Miners and steelworkers wore their kits with pride. The entire community would turn out to support their teams. Match days became rituals, with brass bands, foods, flags, and thousands packed shoulder to shoulder around the muddy pitches. By the 1880s, the game had spread across South Welsh valleys, places like Treori, Mountain Ash, and Neath, and it was moving northward as well. In many ways, Wales was starting to make rugby its own. The style of Welsh rugby also began to shift, influenced by speed, agility, and the need to be able to move the ball quickly on a narrow pitch. And the natural athleticism of the coalfield workers helped the Welsh game emphasize quick passing, support play, and fluid movement rather than the brute force favored in the English clubs. This distinctive approach gave rise to what was later called the Welsh passing game, a beautiful, expansive style that would define national team for generations. By the time the Welsh Rugby Union was formed in 1881, there was enough clubs to merit a national body. Wales had played its first international match that same year, though it was a disaster. England crushed the hastily assembled Welsh side, exposing the need for better organization and coaching. Still, the foundations had been laid, and a matter of 2 decades of rugby in Wales had moved from the domain of schoolboys and professionals to a true people's game. Perhaps most significantly, rugby became a way for Wales to assert its identity in the face of English politics, cultural, and economic dominance. And in the absence of a Welsh parliament or army or any sort of government, the national rugby team became a vessel through which pride, struggle, and ambition were expressed. Every try scored against England was more than just a sporting victory, it was a monument of national defiance. In schools, chapels, pubs, and coalfields, rugby gave Wales and its communities something to rally around. By 1890s, matches between Wales and other home nations were not just contests of athleticism, they were also emotional and symbolic showdowns. Now, we've talked a little bit about Wales as a whole and its experience with rugby. Now I want to focus a bit more in on the specific teams, their foundations, and what really got them going, as well as some of the early players of the game. As rugby spread into Wales, it would find a fertile home. By the early 1870s, the first Welsh clubs, of course, as I mentioned earlier, were being formed. They were obviously modest affairs at first, but they would be ones that would lay the groundwork for something much greater to come. So let's take a look at some of these pioneering clubs, some of whom we've mentioned. Swansea RFC, the original club founded in 1872, was known as the first official club in Wales. Swansea RFC took shape around students and civic leaders in a rapidly growing port town. Within a few years, they were playing matches against nearby Neath and with new Welsh rivals that was being born. Neath RFC often claimed the title of Wales's oldest club, claiming that they were formed in 1871. Neath would later be dubbed as the Welsh All Blacks for their hard-hitting, no-nonsense style, and in the early years they played wherever they could find space, fields, commons, and even cricket grounds. Thus the reason for the differentiation between Neath and Swansea. Obviously, it also would affect the rivalry between the two communities. The next was Newport, which was founded in 1874. It established itself as a powerhouse fairly quickly amongst the various teams. With a growing population and strong backing from local business, the club became a production line of top Welsh talent and a central figure in the national team's development. Llanelli, on the other hand, founded in 1875, if any club captured the soul of Welsh rugby, it was Llanelli. Rooted in a tight-knit industrial town, Llanelli's fierce pride and flair on the field made them a fan favorite. Matches at Stradley Park were more than just sport, they were theater. By the end of the 1870s, clubs were popping up across the country. And, of course, we need to mention Cardiff, who were founded just a year later in 1876. Formed by a mix of former public school boys and working professionals, Cardiff was one of the first clubs to adopt a more tactical approach, shaping the style of Welsh rugby for years to come. They would soon be joined by Pontypool, Carmarthen, Traehori, Aberferon, and others, each becoming rallying points for their communities. These clubs weren't just teams, they were social institutions, bonding agents, and local symbols of identity and pride. With the game booming, it was now time for a national structure, and as we mentioned, in 1881, they formed the Welsh Rugby Union. This was actually done at the Castle Hotel in Neath, as representatives from 11 clubs formed the WRU, which became a pivotal moment that gave Wales its voice in the sport. So, with that set in place, let's talk about some of the legends of the game. First off, we have Arthur Gould, or Gould. I might be mispronouncing, so I'm going to do it both ways, from Newport. If there was a rugby rock star in the 19th century for Wales, it was Arthur. He was a dazzling all-rounder who could play anywhere in the back line. He led Wales to its first Triple Crown in 1893, and it was his fame that reached across the rugby world. So adored was he that fans raised money for a testimonial, sparking an international scandal over professionalism, something of an issue that rugby will face for many years to come. Frank Hancock from Cardiff was more than just a player. He was also a tactical innovator. He was the one who pioneered the modern center partnership that brought the thinking man's game to the Welsh back line. Under his influence, Cardiff became one of the most feared attacking sides in Britain because of their ability to plan and create attacking football, or rugby. Charlie Newman from Newport was a schoolmaster by trade and a strategist on the field. Newman captained Wales in their first international in 1881. Though the team lost badly to England, Newman's leadership helped Wales find its footing as a rugby nation. Next, we have James Bevan, who played for both Cambridge and Cardiff. He, however, was born in Australia and raised in Wales. Bevan was the first man to captain Wales in a rugby international. He was a unifying figure in a team thrown together at short notice, and though his name is often forgotten, his contributions to the early foundations are large. Tom Clapp from Newport was a stalwart forward, always known for his raw power and relentless work rate. He became a symbol of the Welsh pack, tough, disciplined, and always ready to grind it out in the mud. By 1890, Wales had a growing stable of these various strong clubs who had emerged from the national team and a fan base that stretched from the docks of Cardiff to the coal seams of Fronda. Noting that as well, these are all largely southern teams, at least initially. But more importantly, it began to create this rugby culture we mentioned, and a distinctly Welsh one at that. Now, if you want to talk about what a match day would have been like at this point, you really have to get embedded into the heart of the Welsh communities, and you have to look beyond the players and into the crowds. By the 1880s, Saturday afternoon in rugby towns like Llanelli, Neath, and Pontypridd had become community rituals. Local matches would be seen hundreds and sometimes thousands of spectators gather. Miners in their pit boots, chapel deacons with their heavy coats, boys in cinder-covered knees, all pressing in close around the pitch. There were no stadiums, there was no terraces, and no barriers, just ropes strung up between the posts and crowds leaning in so close you could almost touch the players. Brass bands, often from local collieries and chapels, would often march down to the field, playing hymns like Cumbranda or the popular tunes like Men of Harlech. Sometimes these bands would lead the team out onto the field with a stirring pre-match parade. It wasn't just noise, however, it was the sound of belonging, and you can see this is kind of where the idea of singing at games would grow. Here's how the Western Mail, based in Cardiff, described the crowd at Llanelli Newport match in 1888. A sea of caps and shawls, pressing in tight as the whistle blew, and cheering with the force of a furnace bellows as the scarlet jerseys surged forward. This would be Llanelli's team. There was no greater noise in all of Wales, save perhaps the chapel on a Sunday. The connection between the club and community was absolute. A win on Saturday meant a boost to morale for the whole town, retold in pubs, schools, and chapel steps for days. Children would play barefoot rugby in the streets and with whatever they could find, bundles of rags, pig bladders, and even tightly tied sacks. The dream was to one day wear the top of a local team, and maybe, just maybe, the red of Wales. By 1890, it was clear rugby in Wales wasn't just a game anymore. It was a movement, a faith, and in many ways, an unofficial national language of pride and defiance. So, we've now discussed how rugby was established, how it came to Wales, and its effect on the communities. This is just a very quick overview of the establishment, and we'll get further into how it grows from there, how these various clubs grow and develop, and how they become sort of professionalized leading into the 1900s and the creations of things like the Six Nation tournaments, which at that point would have been the Four Nation, and all of those various things that come out of that. But we're well away from that right now. So I just wanted to kind of brush by that. Now, I did mention earlier I was going to talk a little bit about the foundations of the game outside of the UK. So just in case you were wondering, rugby in its earliest form, of course, being a combined game with football, arrived in Canada and America in the early 1800s. Initially, it was played by British soldiers who carried it with them from the universities and schools that they had played it at, and it would soon be picked up by universities such as McGill in Montreal, Harvard, Princeton, and Yale in the 1870s also started to play various rules of what would become known as rugby and or association football. McGill established a rugby union rules for the game, and American schools liked them enough that they as well adopted them, and there was a series of challenge games which were played between McGill and Harvard under these rules until 1876, when the American Ivy League schools, the previous three I mentioned, ended up establishing something that more resembles American football with scrimmage lines, a quarterback initiating the play instead of a scrum, and eventually a four-down rule, all of which were established by 1886, which then, of course, formalized the split from the original rugby union rules. In Canada, the Canadian Rugby Football Union remained under the rugby rules longer, only starting to adopt a Canadian version of the American rules as the century turned. The Canadian game retains one aspect of rugby to this day, and that is actually the name of its trophy that's given to the champion, which is gifted to the league from Lord Alfred Earl Grey, and it was donated in 1909 to the Rugby Football Champion of Canada, which is what it is said on the trophy. Ironically enough, Lord Grey was trying to create a championship for a hockey league, much like Earl Stanley had done the previous decade, which created the Stanley Cup, a very well-known trophy in North America. And if anyone follows hockey, you'll at least have heard of it. The Grey Cup, as it eventually becomes, ends up not being able to go to a hockey championship. And so instead, he creates it for the local rugby league, which is where we get the what is now called the Canadian Football League's version of the trophy, the Grey Cup. Ironically, however, Australian rules football, in case you were wondering, predates the formation and formalization of the rugby union, so is in fact an earlier codified sport. And the foundations of the sport are argued about with various codes, origins, rules, and start dates, and it would take an entire podcast to try and explain how it was evaluated and how those rules came about. And I don't want to do that here. I'm sure there are very much more suited places to discuss, American football and its beginnings, Canadian football and its beginnings, and Australian rules football and its beginnings. And again, like I said, those are just three of the more well-known versions that came out of rugby, which I didn't want to go any farther and delve into other variants which exist across the world. Because, of course, as the British Empire covered the world, all of these various sports would go into these areas, like cricket being so popular in South Asia is because of the British. Rugby being popular in South Africa is because of the British, and New Zealand and Australia and Canada and America. All of these things come about because of the spread of British culture and its effect on the world. And, of course, not least, its effect on Wales and how the game has formed and been played throughout the centuries. And with all that said and done, I would like to thank you for viewing or listening today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com or on various social media sites, usually at Welsh History Pod, or you can reach out to me on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History. I will say when people do send me notes on Instagram, I don't always immediately see them. That's just because of the way Instagram has decided to categorize them. So if you do send me a direct message there, sometimes I don't see it. Make sure you try one of the others because sometimes I pick it up better that way. Or just comment in one of the posts, and I usually see that quite quickly. I don't know why the DMs are so difficult, but yeah. And as well, if you are interested, we do have a Patreon, which you can contribute to. And hopefully in the coming weeks, we'll have some more content going up there soon. So thank you, everyone. Have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.